to the 2019 Gaspar Bacon Lecture. The Gaspar G. Bacon Lectureship was established in 1926, quote, to stimulate a study of the Constitution of the United States, its antecedents, history, and doctrines, together with the results and implications thereof. Over the years, this lectureship has allowed the Boston University community to reflect on the history, meaning, and implications of the U.S. Constitution in a variety of ways, and it has brought an exciting range of scholars to our campus, including Nancy Cott, Gordon Wood, Stephen Pitti, Tom Segru, Pauline Mayer, Sean Wilentz, and Ira Katz-Nelson. Today, we have the great pleasure of welcoming Professor Martha Jones to deliver the 2019 Bacon Lecture. I can think of no scholar better able to carry out the mission of the Bacon Lectureship than Professor Jones. In its essence, Martha Jones' recent book, Birthright Citizenship, explores the antecedents of the principle laid out in the first sentence of the 14th Amendment, that, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Those antecedents, Jones argues, lie in the words and actions of free Black Americans, many of them ordinary people, who enacted their rights on a day-to-day basis in the years before the Civil War. Professor Jones' work, however, does more than consider antecedents in history. It also compels us to grapple with the results and implications of constitutional principles. At a time when politicians consider denying citizenship rights to the US-born children of non-citizens and undocumented immigrants, her work makes a critical and timely intervention. In her deeply researched, historically grounded, and beautifully executed book, Martha Jones's work helps remind us of the great potential for expansiveness and inclusion in the US Constitution and American democracy more broadly. Having received her PhD from Columbia University and her JD from the City University of New York, Martha Jones is currently the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. She has been the recipient of many awards and fellowships, including from the National Humanities Center, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the National Constitution Center. In addition to Birthright Citizens, a history of race and rights in antebellum America, published in 2018 by Cambridge University Press, she is also the author of the 2017 book, All Bound Up Together, The Woman Question in African American Public Culture, as well as numerous articles and essays. And finally, just a few weeks ago, Birthright Citizens received the Liberty Legacy Foundation Award for the best book on the civil rights struggle, from the beginnings of the nation to the present, from the Organization of American Historians. And Martha just mentioned to me, she says this was the first time that this award was given for a 19th century book. It's usually given to 20th century books, so it's a great achievement. Please join me in welcoming Martha Jones.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Okay, you're all out there, good. Thanks very much for having me, and in particular for having me with you for the Bacon Lecture. I want to especially thank Nina Silver. I've been trying not to fangirl this afternoon with you because, of course, you're someone whose work and whose career is very much a light in the work of someone like me. So I'm especially honored and humbled to be here under your auspices. So thank you all very much. I want to talk about Birthright Citizens, and I want to do so through a life history. I had the remarkable pleasure earlier today to visit, is it the Constitution or is it Constitution? I really tried to learn today. But there is a naval frigate here in Boston Harbor that date back to the 18th century that will play a part in my remarks today. So I want to tell this story today in part through the life of a gentleman who did service aboard Constitution back in the 19th century. And here on the left, or on my left, your right, is a marker in Baltimore City's Laurel Cemetery. Laurel is a cemetery that dates back to 1853. It was the first non-sectarian, if you will, African-American cemetery in Baltimore City. The companion image is also of a 19th century Baltimorean, Roger Brooke Tawney, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and a counter figure to Hackett in the story that I'll tell. But it's Hackett, whose life, I think, and whose life story is maybe told in a tragically apt way by the sight of this one time very impressive and dignified cemetery marker, which is now, as I think you can tell, broken into pieces, in disarray, in what is now a largely neglected and abandoned cemetery. For me, this has served as a kind of reminder of the ways in which some parts of our histories of race and citizenship have been neglected, while others, at least until recently, have enjoyed a place on the center stage. We can, I think, contrast the story that Tawney tells in Dred Scott with the story that the life of Hackett tells, or at least that's what I'll try and do with you this afternoon. Hackett is our guide, a man whose life, the arc of his life, really traces the story of birthright citizenship, or at least the first chapter in the story of birthright citizenship in the United States. He's born in 1807 to a family of free African Americans in Baltimore City, really on the cusp of the growth and then the explosion of the community of former slaves who come to settle in Baltimore. He's born just after Maryland has amended its state constitution for the first time to introduce the word white into the state constitutional scheme. African American men, like George's father Charles, will lose the right to vote at the dawn of the 19th century as white is inserted for the first time as a prerequisite to the vote. Hackett will live until 1870, just shy of that moment at which the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, that amendment that goes to extending to the rights of African American men the right to vote, he will live just to the eve of that moment. And this is the arc of the story of this very first chapter of birthright citizenship. Hackett's vision is probably best expressed, or most directly expressed, in 1852 by Barton Delaney, the minister, anti-slavery activist, and journalist, who writes in 1852 of himself and other former slaves, "We are Americans having a birthright citizenship. Our common country is the United States. Here were we born, here raised and educated. Here are the scenes of childhood, the pleasant associations of our school-going days, the loved enjoyments of our domestic and fireside relations, and the sacred graves of our departed fathers and mothers. We are Americans by virtue of having a birthright citizenship, natural claims upon the country, claims common to all others of our fellow citizens, natural rights, which may by unjust laws be obstructed, but never can be annulled. But I'm a little ahead of myself. Many decades before Delaney pens these words, as early as the 1820s, men like George Hackett are asking a question about who they are before the law, about who they are before the Constitution as free African Americans. And where might they look? They begin here in constitutions. George's first education in the Constitution, if you will, comes by way of some powerful, though we might say unorthodox means. His father, Charles, is, for example, an agent to Freedom's Journal, the very first African-American published newspaper beginning in 1827. This is a part of the home in which George is raised. His father is also an AME, or African Methodist Episcopal Church leader, and has a role in not simply the spiritual leadership of this community, but the incorporation of this church, the purchasing of lots and buildings. It takes, it turns out, a lot of legal acumen to establish a church in the early 19th century. Charles Hackett is the man who organizes and publishes the first version of the AME Church's law, the doctrine, the Methodist doctrines and discipline. He will be the agent who ensures that church law is not only set on paper in ink, but that it circulates widely and begins to govern an emerging denomination in the early parts of the 19th century. So this is, in a sense, the kind of legal education that a young man like George receives very early on. And in this setting, African Americans are surely students of the U.S. Constitution. They examine its text, they examine its interpretation. But when it comes to the question of citizenship, when it comes to this question, it turns out that the U.S. Constitution is curiously silent. We know, for example, that the Constitution distinguishes between enslaved people, free people, and Indians, but never does it comment directly on the status of free African Americans or former slaves. We know that the Constitution of 1787 guarantees the privileges and immunities of citizenship, but it never tells us who is entitled to such privileges and immunities. There is this, at least early on in the U.S., a little invoked provision in the Constitution that will be familiar to many of us, that requirement that the president be a natural-born citizen. And this requirement, this clause, is the sort of clause that former slaves seize, they pick up. If the president is a natural-born citizen, why aren't we natural-born citizens? There's certainly such a category, and they observe there's no color line in the U.S. Constitution. And this is the beginning of the development of an argument, of a point of view, of a position that former slaves will take and adopt and further. Now, they also look at the Maryland State Constitution, again, searching for answers about their status, and there they will find absolute silence. That is to say, the word citizen does not appear at all in the Constitution of 1776 in Maryland. And it is this sort of silence, this sort of doubt that certainly shrouds their query and their quest for citizenship, but it is also the kind of silence that leaves room for the building of a case, and this is what men like Hackett will do. Why citizenship? There are two pressures in particular that are bearing down on men like Hackett by the 1820s. The first is a movement that we refer to as colonization. And colonizationists are a curious brand of anti-slavery thinkers. Colonizationists anticipate the end of slavery in the United States, perhaps in years or decades, or maybe for some even a century. But colonizations look forward to slavery's demise. They anticipate it. And their sense is that the future is that of a white man's country, and their movement is one that seeks to remove former slaves from the U.S. Colonizationists raise funds, lobby in legislatures, outfit ships, establish the colony of Liberia. And their vision is that whenever slavery should find its end in the U.S., former slaves have no place in the future as members of the body politic. And this movement, which has a particularly vibrant and virile brand that develops in Baltimore, is a pressure on men like Hackett. The second are black laws. And black laws come out of the state legislature in Maryland. They come out of Annapolis. And here are efforts by state lawmakers to regulate the everyday lives of former slaves. Where can you work? What sort of goods can you own or purvey? Can you travel? Can you gather in public assemblies? Can you own a dog or a gun? These and myriad others of the sort of matters of everyday life are the concern of black laws. And as men like George begin to understand the black laws, they are really a companion to colonization, in that more so than reflecting an interest in the regulation of everyday life, I can tell you black laws are not much enforced. They are intended to create a climate so uncomfortable, so threatening, that people will, in essence, submit, right, to the enticements of colonization and, in essence, self-deport. And these are the pressures on people like Hackett, the pressures that lead them to a quest for citizenship. Citizenship, they believe, is the indelible bulwark against the pressures to otherwise leave the United States. Now, former slaves are not alone in puzzling over this question. So is Congress by the 1820s. And in 1821, the state of Missouri, or I should say the territory of Missouri, has now begun to apply for admission to the Union as a state. Among the tasks is to submit a proposed state constitution to the Congress for review and approval. When Missouri does so in 1821, Congress members are, I'd say, they pause and they puzzle over a particular provision in the proposed Constitution. And it is one that would provide that free people of color are wholly banned from entering the new state of Missouri. Why do Congress members pause? Well, they know about this guarantee of privileges and immunities. They think that means that as a general matter, a citizen of Ohio cannot be regarded differently than a citizen of Missouri or Pennsylvania for the purposes of travel between the states. Is this particular provision constitutional? Well, it depends on whether or not you think free African Americans are citizens entitled to those privileges and immunities. And what emerges is an extraordinary debate that fills many, many pages of the annals of Congress for us today. On the one hand, there are those who take the position that in the U.S., if a person was not a slave or a foreigner, but born in the United States and a free man, going into Missouri, he has the same rights as if born in Missouri. On the other hand, of course, there are those who see no conflict, that whatever status free African Americans might occupy. They are not citizens of the United States for the purposes of this clause. Now, when I first read this debate, I thought, this is terrific. Congress is going to settle this question and give us some clarity. But in fact, what Congress does is what comes to characterize this debate over many decades. It punts. Lawmakers cannot agree. And at the end of the debate, they arrive at, I think, what could best be called, or most kindly be called, an awkward compromise. They permit Missouri to be admitted by way of a constitution that retains this troubling provision. And then Congress admonishes Missouri lawmakers. I don't know what it means exactly to admonish. That doesn't ring a bell for me in the way we think about Congress enacting its authority. But nonetheless, they admonish Missouri not to violate the rights of citizens, including citizens of color. It's a kind of fudge. It's a punt. It is an awkward, and for men like Hackett, a troubling, muddled circumstance. If they can't figure out their status quite, it turns out neither can Congress. George will begin a family. He marries in 1828. He marries the daughter of a family friend. It is a modest but really remarkable dynastic moment in the free African American community in Baltimore. He goes to work first as a waiter, and then in what we'll later recognize as his entrepreneurial edge, he operates a livery stable. He, however, also experiences a series of setbacks. His stable is washed out by a flood, and he loses a number of buildings and horses as well. It's not possible to get restarted in his business running the livery stable. His firstborn child, a son, a namesake George, dies in infancy. It's a difficult moment in the family life. And Hackett does something that we recognize is not uncommon for free African American men who are looking to start or restart their lives, both economically and to some degree reputationally. He goes to sea. And here comes Constitution. He joins the crew of the USS Constitution for a Pacific tour in 1839. He signs up as steward to the Commodore, Alexander Claxton, and he has a remarkable vantage point, a remarkable perch. I visited the space today to get a sense of the way in which those people, and they are few in number and generally very elite in status, those who occupy the Commodore's quarters on a Pacific squadron like the one the Constitution leads, really exist in an extraordinarily rarefied space. And that's where George makes his way. But it is a remarkable journey for a free man of color from Baltimore, because what he begins to glean during this tour is the ways in which the questions that he is asking in Baltimore City are animating cities throughout the Americas. They visit Veracruz, the free city in Mexico. They visit the thriving sugar colony of Cuba, the port of Havana. They spend weeks in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, the capital of the Brazilian Empire, and still a slave trading port in the 1830s. Here, in these spaces, free people of color are not only mixing freely as economic and social agents, they are troubling, animating. They have the attention of lawmakers because throughout the Americas, not simply in Baltimore, there is, in this age of emancipations, a pointed question that must be resolved. Who are free people of color? What is their status before the state, before the empire, before the republic? Who are they in this world? Hackett, it turns out, is asking the question of the moment in Baltimore, not just for him, but for others like him throughout the Americas. Hackett is largely confined to the Commodore's quarters. There's another thing I confirmed today. It turns out when you're in port, you're steward to the Commodore, you're busier than you are ever when you're at sea, because the days are filled with visits from dignitaries and others looking to establish relations with the U.S. and its Navy. But he does learn a remarkable range of things even from this perch, and they have a great deal to do with citizenship. Now, on the one hand, Hackett would be, like many of the sailors aboard the Constitution, in possession of a Seaman's Protection Certificate. These certificates, federally issued documents, are carried by U.S. sailors precisely so that when they are in open seas or foreign ports, they can resist impressment into foreign service, right? I am not available or obliged to serve the British Navy because I am a U.S. citizen. Black sailors carry these small, fragile, but remarkable documents that evidence their status as U.S. citizens. And on the other hand, in this same moment, when Hackett and men like him visit U.S. ports, particularly a port like Charleston in South Carolina, they will be subject to Negro Seamen's Acts. These are acts that regard them as non-citizens, near criminals, so much so that they are subject either to confinement aboard ship or detention in a jail in their own home U.S. ports. This is the contradiction, right, that characterizes Hackett's world. One can carry a Seaman's Protection Certificate and be jailed without cause and without process when entering a U.S. port. Now, the other thing about being on a naval flotilla, and I think one of the, this is where the lessons really come for Hackett, is that it turns out there's a great deal of law business that goes on during the course of a Pacific voyage, such as that the Constitution leads. I don't have to be explicit with you when I tell you that in any moment when the Constitution is at port, when sailors are off for 24 or 48 hours of leave, there's a lot of mischief. I'll just call it mischief, right? There's a lot of mischief that goes on. And these infractions are tried in brief but meaningful tribunals aboard the Constitution, run out of the Commodore's quarters. And what's important for us is that in these proceedings, Hackett sees something that would be impossible in Baltimore City, and that is when naval tribunals, big or small, convene, black sailors, when they possess evidence or relevant testimony, can speak against the interests, offer evidence against the interests of white sailors, something that the black laws in Maryland prohibits. The second bit has to do with punishment. And here again, Hackett would observe that when white sailors, and black sailors alike, but most remarkable for him, when white sailors are convicted of an offense, they will be punished, and they will be punished by the lash. Here again, something not possible in Baltimore. Only African Americans are still subject to the lash when convicted of a crime. The lash, of course, is that symbolic tie, right, that links free African Americans to the status of slaves, something too degrading for white men in Baltimore City, but something possible here in the naval context. And I want you to see the ways in which Hackett is beginning, again, to study law in an unorthodox sort of way, but perhaps as importantly, in a regime where the rules the racial etiquette, the social order of a state like Maryland can be upended. George is getting an education. The Commodore dies of dysentery. George is released from his duties out on the Pacific coast of South America. He boards a whaler, the Anne, which is out of Nantucket, and makes his way back to the U.S. over the course of months. Remarkably, he disembarks in Nantucket in 1841, just 2 weeks after Frederick Douglass has given his very first public anti-slavery speech in Nantucket. He steps off right into the heart of radical anti-slavery. Not sure what he imbibes there, but what he does next is what makes him remarkable for our purposes, because he returns home to Baltimore City. If men like Douglass have found themselves in New York and New England and Pennsylvania, and built a political movement for civil rights and against slavery there, Hackett will return to Baltimore, to the slaveholding state, a largely free city, to do the same. He becomes one of the very few African-American property holders in this period. He purchases a small home and a lot. His family thrives, and we can find in the local newspaper an elaborate report about now his young daughter's wedding. He becomes a deacon in the AME church, not unlike his father, really following in Charles's footsteps. Wasn't he a citizen? Well, how would one make the case in a place like Baltimore? Well, it turns out that Hackett shows up here. This is an image of the Baltimore City Courthouse in Hackett's period. And we find him here again and again in quotidian ways, in piecemeal ways, but in powerful ways, making claims to his access to a set of civil rights, protecting his persons and his property. This courthouse becomes, if you will, Hackett's podium, becomes his newspaper. It becomes the scene in which he will make this long argument about citizenship. The first time we find him here, he's gotten into a dust-up on the streets. He's been, as he says, assaulted by a white man named John Pitt. This is not unusual, I want to tell you, in the streets of Baltimore in the 1840s. But what Hackett does in response is remarkable, because what he does is walk himself over to this courthouse, visit a sheriff, swear out a complaint, appear at a trial, testify against Pitt, and win. He ends the day with $1 in his pocket for his trouble. But I want you to hear the way in which he's using the space of the local courthouse to push against the kinds of limits that black laws are said to impose, to reach for a kind of justice that he had seen enacted in the Navy. I said he's become a leader in the AME church, and more so than on any other question, we find him in the courthouse doing the business of Black Methodists in Baltimore. Mostly what he's doing is protecting his church community, its property, its resources from predatory lenders and speculators who always have one eye on African American property owners, in this case a collective property ownership, looking to take advantage of their financial fragility, their vulnerability when it comes to dollars and cents. And we find Hackett protecting this property in the courthouse regularly, testifying against the interests of white speculators, white mortgage holders, white lenders, in the effort to protect this institution and to leave it stronger than when he found it. Now, if the local courthouse is not quite a place where one stands up and says, I am a citizen, right, even as one is performing and comporting oneself as such, not so far away in Annapolis, in the state capital, Maryland's lawmakers are gathering to confront that question head on. 1850-51, Maryland drafts an entirely new state constitution from scratch, and it takes 18 months. And through this long proceedings, every learned, distinguished, prominent lawmaker in the state of Maryland makes an appearance and weighs in on the terms of the new state constitution. And from the start, lawmakers are clear that among the reasons to hold a constitution is that they need to settle the status of men like Hackett. Men like Hackett seem to be comporting themselves like they are citizens, commentators say. And state lawmakers settle in for a long convention during which they propose to settle this matter. Now, again, like Congress, decades before, weeks and weeks spent on debates. Are free men of color citizens? Are they aliens? Are they denizens? Are they human beings? Are they freemen? Lawmakers debate these questions a very long time. They can't figure it out, or at least they can't agree. So they appoint a committee, and they're going to send the committee off to draft some resolutions, some proposed sections for this new constitution, which the committee does. And when the committee comes back, they present their conclusions, and lawmakers cannot agree. And finally, after 18 months, these learned, experienced, seasoned, and deeply invested lawmakers fail and wind up inserting one meager clause into this Constitution that simply empowers the legislature to decide the status of free people of color. That's as far as they can get. And this is the state of things. I've mentioned in passing Dred Scott versus Sanford. For many of us, this is where we would enter the story. This is where we would begin the tale. Chief Justice Taney from the U.S. Supreme Court in March 1857 will opine that no person of color of African descent, be they enslaved or free, can be a citizen of the United States. Taney would love you to think that that resolved the question, but it did not. And it turns out that the dissenters in Dred Scott, in particular Justice McLean, as they ride the circuit, will look to and effectively bar the application of Dred Scott in lower federal courts. We are pressed to find an example of a free person of color who is kept out of federal courts after Dred Scott. McLean, parses the facts. It's a good lawyer's technique, is it not? He said Dred Scott was about people of color who descended from slaves. The man in my court, in one example, is descended from free people, and so Dred Scott does not apply. In 1858, the following year, the state of Maryland at its high court, at its court of appeals, will hear the case of Hughes versus Jackson. And in Hughes versus Jackson, the appellant will argue that Jackson, who had initiated the suit in a county court, a free man of color, the argument will go, Jackson's suit should fail, not on the merits. Jackson's suit should fail because, in essence, the state of Maryland should adopt the logic of Dred Scott, incorporate that logic into its constitutional scheme, such that Jackson would be prohibited from suing in the state courts. But in Maryland, the High Court says no to Dred Scott. Why? Justice John Carroll LeGrand's reasoning is important for us, for appreciating why this debate is breaking down, why it's so difficult to resolve for lawmakers. LeGrand says two important things. The first, he says, there are 90,000 free people of color in the state of Maryland. It's 1858. 90,000 free people of color, 25,000 of them in Baltimore. And he says, these people are workers. They are an important dimension of our productivity and prosperity as a state. What man would work, and work well, if he couldn't expect to come into our courts and protect his wages and the fruits of his labor? As long as free people of color are here, as long as we expect them to work, we have to give them access to our courts. We have to extend to them the right to sue and be sued. And then Legrand says a second thing. He says, if I, and I'm paraphrasing, if I were to deem free people of color outside the bounds of law, outside the reach of our Constitution, I would, in one grand gesture, create a community of 90,000 outlaws in the state of Maryland, right? People who will certainly still be here, who will certainly continue to have disputes, and who will now settle those disputes on streets and alleys and lawns and fields, rather than in our courthouse. This is not a formula, right, for prosperity or social order in Maryland. We invite free people of color into our courthouse because that is how we ensure the well-being of the state of Maryland. And Dred Scott is not the law for men like Hackett. The last time I find Hackett in the courthouse, it's 1859. And he, like many hundreds of Baltimoreans, particularly small entrepreneurs, has fallen on hard times after a fiscal downturn in 1857. He is bankrupt, and he comes into the courthouse to file for insolvency. For our purposes, his petition is fascinating because he is required to enumerate all the debts owed to him, some $1,100 from more than 20 folks with whom he's done business, black and white. He himself owes somewhere between $800 and $900, again, to a diverse array of individuals. But part of what we see in the text and the pages of this insolvency application is the way in which Hackett has woven himself into the local associational economy of Baltimore, made himself a sort of economic citizen, which means he can come into the courthouse and expect to be relieved of his debts as state law provides. He has to testify against his white creditors, some of whom object to the extinguishment of his debts, and his deposition is the vehicle by which Hackett explains to the court the circumstances under which he has arrived at this moment and at these straits in his fiscal life. He exercised that capacity to contract, to sue and to be sued, to testify, all things that the black laws do not provide for or anticipate, and he will indeed have his debts forgiven. One last chapter. In 1859, colonizationists are still very much a part of the political culture in a state like Maryland. Curtis Jacobs is leading the charge in this year in Annapolis, and Jacobs proposes a set of black laws, new black laws, that are more draconian than any that had preceded them. Jacobs proposes that free people of color have one of two choices. Either they submit to being enslaved, or in his nomenclature, re-enslaved. Sorry, I just lost the picture, but as long as you can see it, we're good. Either free people of color are going to submit to enslavement or re-enslavement, find a white person and sign up to be a slave, or they will submit to being exiled, removed from the state of Maryland, and for good measure, they will surrender all their property to the state. Hackett gets wind of this, and you can imagine the kind of concern, the kind of alarm that this ignites in Baltimore. And Hackett acts. He organizes, circulates a petition, collects hundreds of signatures, black and white Baltimoreans, all of whom, I think I'm okay. Tap the screen. Thank you very much. All of whom are opposed to Jacobs's bill. And then Hackett will do that thing that citizens do, which is he will petition his government. He will take himself from Baltimore City to Annapolis, enter the State House, and I'm quite sure he is the first man of color to stand in the doorway of the delegates' chamber. He is there to deliver his petition and to challenge Jacobs and his ideas. Now, one version of the story goes that the two take it outside and they roll around on the courthouse lawn. I'm never sure if that's true, but I read it somewhere, so I like it as an image. The State House in Baltimore is on a hill, and you can sort of imagine the comical sort of edge to that sort of scene. What I am sure of is that Jacobs and Hackett debate this question. They meet one another, they face off, and go back and forth. And Jacobs is confident. He says, this government was made exclusively for the benefit of the white population. Free black people were the root of slave uprisings, from the bloody massacre of the whites by the slaves of the island of Haiti to the sad event at Harper's Ferry, which is very much in the near view mirror for these lawmakers in Annapolis. Hackett speaks, as he says, on behalf of the 90,000 free people of color in Maryland. He represents all of them, and he quite forthrightly asserts to Jacobs that they possess constitutional and legal rights, and they will not stand for this sort of grave wrong, this injustice, as a body of individuals. And the Jacobs Law will be defeated. And over these years, I hope you get a sense of the way in which Hackett's thinking is changing, but more importantly, his tactics have evolved. That across now decades, he has gone from the modest study of law, informal, idiosyncratic, but a kind of learning about the Constitution, to then a kind of testing of limits and possibilities in a local setting where he has access, and where his assertions fall upon, if not sympathetic, open ears among Maryland lawmakers. But in this moment, in 1859, in this moment of a crisis, Hackett will shift his tactics once again, and now take himself to Annapolis and become something like a lobbyist, but certainly more like a citizen petitioning his government. Last bit. Oftentimes we tell this story as one that begins in 1862. Attorney General Edward Bates will issue an opinion, here now part of the Civil War era Lincoln administration, an opinion that will conclude that free people of color, citizens of the United States. In 1866, the Civil Rights Act, in its first provision, will conclude and assert that all persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States, regardless of color, regardless of a previous condition of servitude. By 1868, the 14th Amendment will be ratified, that first section that Nina Silber read for us, that promises, guarantees birthright citizenship to all persons born in the United States. I like to imagine Hackett sort of satisfied that Washington had finally caught up, right, with the sort of arguments that he and men like him had been making for many decades before we get to the 1860s. But if you know anything about Hackett, and you know a little after my talk today, it won't surprise you that he doesn't really wait for lawmakers in Washington to catch up. In the earliest weeks and months of Reconstruction in Maryland, Hackett is out, now a member of the Republican Party, openly and powerfully advocating for the voting rights of African Americans, the restoration of voting rights among African Americans in the state of Maryland. He is appearing before the city council, where he has long been a party to a grievance, taxation without representation when it came to public education. He had paid taxes for years, but his children had no access to public schools. Now he is part of a lobbying effort that will see through the establishment of those first black public schools. He will head the first African-American-led militia in Baltimore City, the Butler Guard. And this group will don uniforms, bear arms, gather in formation in the streets of Baltimore, making manifest in new ways their claim to citizenship, in ways that weren't possible in the preceding decade, all before we get to the moment of the 14th Amendment. Hackett didn't wait. He just waited for Washington to catch up. This image is that of the national celebration in 1870 of the ratification of the 15th Amendment, that amendment that constitutionalizes the right to vote for African American men. If you didn't know, this celebration takes place not in Washington, but in Baltimore City. And in fact, this scene is unfolding just in the shadow of that local courthouse where Hackett had spent so many years claiming, assembling, performing his citizenship. Now, in the near shadow of that structure, he is not here because he has died. He has passed away just months before. But certainly, if you think in these terms, you are like me, and you know that he is here in spirit. You know that for him, this is the culmination of a lifetime of claims making, a lifetime of struggle, a lifetime of theorizing citizenship. So I too hope he was here and that he enjoyed the show. It was a remarkable one. And with that, I'll say thank you very much. If that's okay. Fine. Yeah, I think I know some folks have to step out, but if Nina would help me, I'd be happy to answer questions. Oh my gosh. So.
Yeah, right there. Yes, Charlie.
Oh, hello.
Hi.
Fantastic. I read the book. I loved it. And you spent a lot of time talking about citizenship. But I was wondering if you could parse out maybe some cultural, social differences from that first part, the birthright. Are there different conceptions of being born in black and white communities? And why is birth something to gravitate towards in this narrative?
Yeah, thank you for that. I should say that the folks I write about are not political theorists. They are not academics. They are not treatise writers. They are activists and advocates. And what that means, as I posit it, is that they are profoundly improvisational in these debates, which is to say they are trying on a lot of arguments. They're trying out a lot of arguments that might get them to citizenship, and birthright is one of them. So I'll come back to your question, but it's important to say they, for example, debate importantly the sort of status that should derive from their labor, and particularly the unrequited labor that many of them and their forebears expended as enslaved people. Shouldn't that entitle them to citizenship? They draw on military service. This is a community that includes fewer men who were veterans of the Revolutionary era for most of this debate, but many, many Black Baltimoreans who were part of the conflict that it was the War of 1812. And so they draw on military, and they wonder if that shouldn't be the criteria. But they settle on birthright, and I think there were two reasons. I think one is because of that clause in the Constitution. They really do think that there is a understated, muted, but absolute affirmation in the Constitution of 1787. In that view, they would say you don't need the 14th Amendment at all. You just need to correctly interpret the Constitution of 1787, and you would recognize birthright citizenship without a color line. So there is that. And then secondly, that is reinforced because in these debates that many of which, as I've described, wind up in a tie, wind up in a fumble, wind up unresolved, they know that there are among lawmakers those who are not simply sympathetic in a political sense, but subscribe to their view that there are really two statuses of person before the Constitution of the United States, citizens and aliens. They are surely not aliens. And so this is an argument that is gaining traction. Now, it's important, I don't know what's quite underneath your question, but what might be underneath your question, of course, there are those in these communities who are not natural born or birthright individuals at all, that there are Black migrants into the United States. And this story continues, not in this book, but it continues in the real world, in 1870, right, when Congress will then amend the Naturalization Act to add people of African descent as among those eligible, along with so-called white persons, as among those eligible to become naturalized citizens. So that in a sense finishes the work that the 14th Amendment begins. But they really do this because they think it's in the Constitution. I might, on some days I do too. And more to the point, they get traction, right? They get those very highly placed lawmakers who concur even if they can't carry the day. So thank you.
I was wondering where
Hi.
Women fit into the story and the legal arguments. Does it get extended or is there tension there?
Yeah. I don't see a tension, or at least not an expressed tension. What I see is silence. That I think it's not overstating it to say that the citizen. So women figure. Let me back up. Women figure importantly because part of the argument is that even so-called white women are citizens, even white children are citizens, right? So that citizenship as a baseline matter reaches far, right, into the populace of the U.S. in this period, that not all citizens enjoy the same rights and privileges. And sometimes the question is posed, right, are former slaves analogous to women, right? Citizens without or with inferior rights, are they analogous to children, citizens with inferior rights, or are they a different sort of category? So in that sense, women figure into the debates. But African American women don't figure very much in the courthouse. And I think this is an artifact of the way in which, certainly, for example, in Hackett's church community, African American women are part of the internal debates within an AME church as these lawsuits and challenges to their autonomy are being leveled at the church. But the folks who go into the courthouse are, by and large, men. That having been said, and thank you for the question, I think there are two things. One, to take away. One is that I think this helps us understand why the folks we meet in the 1860s who are debating political rights in that all-important coalition of abolitionists and anti-slavery activists, civil rights activists, women's rights activists. There are many of them who are just not well versed in how women fit into this question of citizenship. Women, freedom, yes. Citizenship is not sort of where those debates have been, for example, in the colored convention movement. The convention movement is very preoccupied with citizenship, but does not take it to the place that we know it will go very quickly in the 1860s. The other reflection is that I think this is a generational question. Hackett has children, and his first wife will pass away, and he'll remarry in the 1850s. And his second wife has a young daughter, Henrietta. And in his will, he provides elaborately for Henrietta, not simply for her support, but in particular for her education. And she and her mother will migrate to Washington, and she will be very carefully and particularly and excellently educated in Washington. She'll become a performer, a singer for a time, but by the early 20th century, she is not only a member of the United Negro Improvement Association, not only a Garveyite, but she will be the woman who will take over for Garvey when he is detained and otherwise not available to lead the UNIA. So George is long gone, but I think seeing Henrietta Vinton Davis, and this is the work of historian Natanya Duncan that I'm drawing upon for that bit of the story, is a reminder that there's a generational story here about African American women in public culture, in political life, defining their own terms of citizenship. And Henrietta, I'd like to think is doing precisely what Hackett would have had her do, even as her mother would not have been a public figure in the same terms. And so maybe that's part of the story, and I end just as that sort of turn is afoot. So thank you for that.
Yes, Charlie? We might need you to speak up.
Thank you very much. It's the generation of George's father that these are the men who know Lundy, who know Garrison, who collaborate with them, who write with them and for them. They are gone from Baltimore by the time George is coming of age. And that is important, not just as a fact, but it is in part a way of permitting me to say that part of what's happening in these years is that Maryland and Baltimore is becoming increasingly distant and isolated from places like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. That by the time George is coming of age, to possess the colored American or the North Star is seditious and is a dangerous business and is a crime. Some of you may know the story of Samuel Green, who's a free man of color on the eastern shore of Maryland. Green is discovered to own a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin and is prosecuted in Maryland. So it's to say that it becomes increasingly difficult for men like Hackett to maintain really robust, vibrant, open ties to the anti-slavery scene that they're profoundly aware of, but I think cannot be connected to in the ways that his father's generation had been. And that's part of the story, is that this is a community that will wrestle with and actually entertain colonization for a much longer time, right? They're ridiculed by men in Boston and New York who have dismissed colonization for decades, but still in the 50s, right? Black Baltimoreans are aware of what's wrong with colonization and are also despairing, right, of what their prospects are in a state like Maryland. So there is a distance. I'm not sure precisely what you're asking about when you ask me about race. What I'd say is that part of the reason I choose Baltimore and part of what I discover as I work in the archives is how naturalized ideas about who is white and who is black are in a city like Baltimore. Baltimore may be the largest, and it is indeed the largest community of free people of color in the United States before the Civil War, but it is also markedly poorer, much more markedly working class than a city like New Orleans or Philadelphia. Those are probably the two places to which it most often is compared. So that's to say, I don't see in my archives much consternation or consideration. Certainly color matters a great deal in this courthouse, and nearly every black litigant will be marked as such, whether it's germane or irrelevant to the proceedings. So color certainly matters, but if you will, the sort of fine-grained thinking that might more characterize a community of color like that in New Orleans isn't present here as best I can see it. I thought I would have a chapter about marriage, and I would sort of get to that in the way like people like Deanna Williams have done so expertly in New Orleans, Jennifer Spear and others. And it's just, as best I can tell, not a story in Baltimore. In any way, at least I can discern in this courthouse, that people think they know who is black and they think they know who is white. If we think that's all a fiction, they might too, but they know how to use those terms in a way that, to me, more reflects a kind of consensus than a debate. So thanks very much for the questions. Hi.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Could you tell us a little bit more about the role of the Navy in your story, and especially as an incubator? It sounds like a radicalism, or at least a different way of thinking and acting.
Yeah.
I was reminded a lot of the story of Olaudah Equiano in the British context, where the Navy played a really similar role for him. So to extrapolate.
Yeah, sure. This is, of course, Jeff Bolster's work, not mine, that reminds us that, going to sea is one of the most common occupations for free men of color, be it, I think he says from Maine to Mississippi. He doesn't say that. It was some alliteration, right? It's up and down the seaboard, right? So in some ways, Hackett is doing something not remarkable. I guess what I would say is that his journey was especially illuminating when it comes to the law dimension of the story, because the naval logs are so beautifully preserved and detailed in Washington at the National Archives, because one of the sailors aboard the Constitution writes a memoir, a sort of humorous memoir that is very illuminating when it comes to how racism is working on board the ship. The captain's letters, Daniel Turner's letters have survived, and even some of the Commodore's letters. So I had a special, I think, opportunity to really understand what the day-to-day was like for Hackett. I don't know how, for example, the naval experience would compare, right, to a merchant vessel. But I suspect there's a whole lot less law in the formal sense. And part of what's remarkable about the captain's letters, right, is how much ink is spilled and how much time is spent convening tribunals, assigning lawyers and advocates. It's remarkable, in fact, to me still, that with all else that's going on and all the challenges that are going on that are sort of dramatic and about the, the sea and the ship and the seaworthiness, all that sort of wonderful stuff, they are convening tribunals and trying men summarily and in very formal proceedings. So I think there's more to do, I guess, is what I'd say with the Navy. And one of the things that I appreciated today about visiting Constitution was that, in part their work has centered on an earlier period. And so this is a much later period. This is not war. This is a Pacific squadron that is doing everything from shuttling diplomats to lightly policing the slave trade and mostly offering cover to whalers in the Pacific is what they're doing. But along the way, they are this microcosm for some 400 men in from very different stations of life who are being forced to take their ideas and being thrust into this roiling Atlantic world where the kinds of questions that Hackett has are everywhere. So I think I suppose I would be very excited. I have a former student, Zach Coppin, at the University of Michigan, for whom this is a project on the horizon, and I hope he'll do more with it because I think we can do a lot more with it, and that's part of the story of the Navy is the archive, right? They let you do that because they save the good paper. So I don't know. I hope that's a start anyway. Thank you.
How does Hackett view this sort of mission in a national context? Is it sort of, it's going to recruit Maryland and that's where it ends? Is it ASCO, Maryland, ASCO, so the other states of the Union? You can turn Maryland as a sign for other people? Or, like I said, is this sort of just his backyard?
That's a great question. I don't have a sense of how he thinks about that. And it's an important question. He certainly is cognizant, right, of the big picture. But interesting. So I guess the place I've looked to really discern what Hackett thinks. Well, I have to always look at what he does, but what he does after the war is interesting. And so, the last public appearance that Hackett makes is in 1869. It's Washington, D.C., and it is the first of the national colored conventions that is meeting there that includes now men from the southern as well as the northern states, right? So all of these kinds of prohibitions and restrictions that he himself had been subject to are lifted, and he's a delegate to the 1869 colored convention. That's remarkable in and of itself, to the degree that it reflects sort of his understanding that now the project is to become linked, right, to free men of color from across the country. But he becomes part of a delegation that when the conference itself or the convention itself concludes is going to do some lobbying in Washington. Their first stop is to the newly elected president, Ulysses Grant. And they're there to lobby Grant for the 15th Amendment. So I think that's the answer to your question, right? And then they will go on to meet with, I guess, the Senate committee that is charged with the drafting of the actual 15th Amendment and have that debate. And so I think what Hackett does when the the shackles are lifted, I think tells us a great deal about his vision. And in a sense, he returns to this national community that his father had access to early on. So thanks for reminding me of that moment, because I think it tells us a lot about how he's thinking about Maryland and the rest of the nation.
So we have time for one more question. If somebody has one, we have time for it.
Sure.
You commented on Darwin and the connection, the early migration between the West Indies and the American movement, pine and palm, and a number of expressions of that connection. So if we look at the migration during that period out of the Caribbean, takes us to Great Barrington, Massachusetts. So Du Bois, pronounced Du Bois here, and I have a colleague who works on African American history, his name is Du Bois.
I know both gentlemen. Thank you.
In what way does that migration going on reflect on how people claim ownership, belongingness to the North American experience? You have the Haitian Revolution, takes place in the middle of all this. So how did they deal with that? Du Bois was descended from Haitian ancestry, one generation, two generations back.
So I mentioned that there are these stories about Hackett that, like this dust up with Jacobs on the lawn. There's another story about the Hackett family is actually migrants from the British Caribbean. It's one of the stories I can't write because I can't find the evidence for it. But Daniel Murray, many years ago, when he was working on his Encyclopedia Africana, wrote about Hackett, and his manuscript notes claim that they were descended themselves from the British, that they were migrants from the British Caribbean. I just couldn't find any evidence of that. But it's to say, it's always been a question for me. And I'm thinking now about, the debates within the colored convention movement, which is where we see kind of the full-throated expression of the kinds of ideas that Hackett is working with. And if other people have a different idea, I'd be interested. But for me, I don't see evidence of the kind of nuanced thought or the kind of troubled thinking that Birthright might invite, the claim to Birthright might invite, which is to say there are folks who are not going to become citizens by virtue of the 14th Amendment or any sort of affirmation of birthright because they're not born in the United States. And in other work, I work on Haitian migrants from out of the Haitian Revolution in Baltimore. And so I'm aware that they are not just an idea, they are present in Baltimore City. And from that work, I'd say, there's a fudge that goes on, I think, for some free people of color, former slaves, after the 14th Amendment, which is you get swept up and you live and work and vote and do other things by virtue of the assumption that you're born in the U.S., rather than by the necessity of proving that. So in this household of enslaved refugees from Saint-Domingue that I write about in the third generation, by the 1870s, there is a young man, Jean-Francois is his name, but he becomes John Francis in Baltimore. But he apparently speaks, his English is inflected with an accent, and he goes to vote in the 1870s, and he's barred because they think he's Cuban, I don't think he's not Cuban at all. What he is he's part of this community of Saint-Domingue refugees. He's U.S. born, but probably French speaking at home and as a first language, or Creole speaking. And they stop him at the polls, and he can't vote. He's part of a Republican Party club, and he's a visible, active guy. So it's not wrong for us. I think I just want to affirm the question, right? That how someone like him fits in. I think Jean-Francois passes as an American, right? Passes as a birthright citizen until he gets to the polls and someone is eager for political reasons to keep him from voting. And now the sound of his voice, the accent, the lilt becomes a charge that prevents him. Or I think what they do is they invalidate his registration when he shows up to vote. So, and this is part of the story that I think I'm trying to tell, which is that the way in which citizenship and rights is evolving in these scenes is not by way of some, well-studied, thoroughly considered, systematic, right, iteration of the question. That on the ground, people are making up citizenship and rights and who's in and who's out very much out of circumstances. And Maryland will be among those states that very quickly, right, redeems itself, which is to say the little bit of Reconstruction that Maryland has disappears very quickly in the 1870s. And I think of what happens to Jean-Francois as a reflection of that, right, as now the tide has turned, and whatever means on the ground white officials can use to keep men of color from the polls, they will, including accusing them of not being birthright citizens and not entitled to the vote. So I don't have a big answer for it, but it's a really good question, and I thank you for letting me remember him and think about how he fits into this story. So thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all.